In this video, we are going to briefly discuss null. Null is one of those things that you kind of see in your code and maybe you've used it before, but I think it's pretty common that it's never formally covered or addressed. So I just wanted to make a brief video kind of formally talking about null and giving you a little bit of a kind of formal introduction to what null is all about. So null is a keyword or reserved word in Java, and null represents no value. So it's the absence of a value. Now, null can be used as a default value for variables. So instance data variables, those are variables declared outside of any method but inside the class, are given a default value when they're declared. This is not true of local variables, so be aware of that. When you declare a local variable inside your method, you do have to give it an initial value. It's not automatically given an initial default value, but instance data variables are. And every data type has its own default value depending on that type. Null is the default value that's used for objects when they have been declared but not initialized. So for example, if you had a private integer instance data variable, the default value for integers is 0. If you have a private string name, the default value of name is going to be null. That's the default value, and remember, null means no value. It means that name doesn't have a value. If you have a default or an instance data variable of type student, again, the default value is going to be null. The default value for any object instance data variable is null, and again, that means sort of a lack of that variable doesn't have a value. It's a lack of value. So null can be assigned to any object reference or variable, but it can't be assigned to primitive. So you could do this, student s equals null, that would be allowed. You cannot do this, int n equals null. That's not allowed because int is a primitive type, and you can't use null as a value for primitive types. You could assign null to a capital I integer, the wrapper class, because that is an object. Now, I'm not saying that this is necessarily good practice to initialize variables as null, but it is technically allowed in the language. There's actually a bit of debate about whether null is kind of a useful thing or not useful thing, and how it should be used and how often it should be used explicitly like this. So you are welcome to read a little bit more about that. But what the main thing I want you to know is that these lines here would be allowed because the types are objects, but this one would not because that type is a primitive. So what can you do with the null? Well, you can compare variables to null using the double equal sign. This will tell you whether a variable is null. And typically when we do that, we check to see if something is not null. Sometimes we'll check to see if it's null, but I think most common we check to make sure something isn't null before we move forward and do something with it. So for example, if student is not equal to null, I'll do something with it. Or if student is not equal to null and that student meets some criteria, I'll do something with the student. This is a common setup you'll see because it leverages the short-circuited nature of Java conditional statements like this. So with an and an or, Java will evaluate the first operand or the first expression first, and if the result of the full conditional can be determined from just that first part, the second part is never evaluated. So the idea here is, let's say student was null. If student was null, this would be false. And if one part of an and is false, the whole thing is false. So that means we'll never evaluate this expression here. And that's a good thing because if it was null, if student was null, this would crash. So you will see this set up sometimes where you check if something isn't null first, and then if that's true, you go ahead and check the other criteria, and then inside the conditional, you do whatever you want with it. So pretty much that's all we do with null is or null variables. We can compare to see if they're null, and we do that with the double equal sign or the not equal sign. So what can't you do with null or null variables? Pretty much everything else. So you really can't do anything with a variable whose value is null. Most importantly, you cannot invoke any methods or try to access any variable on a null any instance data variable on a null variable. So you basically, if a variable is null, you can't say dot anything. A null variable dot anything will throw a null pointer exception, which will crash your program. So you can't invoke dot equals, you can't invoke dot string, you can't invoke dot anything on a null variable. A null pointer exception is a particularly bad exception because it's almost always the result of programmer error. This type of exception is almost always entirely preventable. So getting this kind of error in your program is a really bad thing that we want to avoid. So again, anytime you have an object variable, if its value is null, then you can't say dot anything. You can't invoke any methods, you can't access any fields or instance data variables, nothing. So for example, if s was null and we try to invoke s dot equals hello, this will crash. That's very bad. If we said s double equals hello, this would be allowed because you are allowed to compare null variables with a double equal sign. This won't crash and it will return a false because null isn't equal to any value. It's the absence of a value. Okay. For example, here, if we have a student that we initialize to null and we try to print out student.name, let's say this is instance data variable in the student class, that will also crash. So we can't invoke any method, we can't access any instance data variable. So basically no dot, anything. Now, null becomes very important when we deal with nodes and linked lists. So just kind of keep this information in mind for when you're learning about nodes and learning about linked lists, because null becomes very significant in those cases. One last clarification I want to make about null relates to null and string. So a string, the empty string, a string whose value is the empty string, is not null. These are different. The empty string is different from null. Okay, the empty string is a string that doesn't contain any characters, but it's not null. It does have a value. It has a string value. It's just that that string doesn't have any characters. So for example, if string s1 equals two double quotes right next to each other, this is the empty string. It's a string whose length is 0. If string s2 equals null, this is a string with this is a null string. It has no length, it has no value, it's null. So if you were to ask if s1 double equal sign s2, you'd get false because the empty string and null are not the same thing. So be really careful about that. So for example, if s1 is the empty string, s2 is declared as null, and s3 isn't given a value, so its default value is null, we would be allowed to invoke any method we want on s1 because it is a string with a value. Now, if we were to print out, the uppercase version, nothing would be printed because it's the empty string. There's no characters. If we were to print out the length of s1, we'd get 0. If we tried to convert s2 to uppercase, the program would crash with a null pointer exception. If we tried to access the length of s3, the program would crash with a null pointer exception. Okay, so this is an important distinction, the difference between the empty string and null. And again, there's some debate about whether if you're kind of working with strings and you need to give some initial value to a string before it gets its real value, there's some debate about whether you should give that string the value of the empty string or to give it the value of null. So again, you're welcome to kind of read a little bit about that on your own and develop your own kind of best practice for how you want to treat that. So this was a brief overview of null, and hopefully now you have a little bit of an understanding of a keyword that maybe you've seen before or maybe used before, but maybe not known all the details about, and hopefully now you have a little bit of a better understanding. Any questions about null, please post to the discussion board.